and individuals are starting to join. So,
Oh, great.
yeah. Welcome to those of you who are joining our Cultural Thursday today with Dr. Mitchell Berg. I'm glad you could join us. It's a beautiful day to be in front of the computer, so we're happy that you're here to learn with us. I'm looking out my window at the blue skies. And I've got noon, but I know we started late, so we'll just wait another minute if that's okay, Dr. Berg.
All right, sounds good.
Give people a chance to join us here. This session will be recorded, so if you're aware of anyone who wasn't able to join us, we will be sharing the link in a couple of days. We like to make sure there's captioning on there, and it's available otherwise on the Central Lakes College YouTube channel. Our videography department helps us with that. So just a couple of housekeeping items here. There is, of course, there's the chat. However, if you have questions, if you could write them in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a Q&A as well. And I will do my best to keep my eye on the chat and the Q&A. And Dr. Berg may be stopping occasionally throughout the presentation to address any questions. Otherwise, we will also take questions at the end.
Okay.
So I think we'll get started. You know, I was made aware of Dr. Berg through our Raider Connect coach at the college, Rosie Germstad, who also lives in Mahnomen, or maybe close to Mahnomen, I'm not sure. And so I've just recently become acquainted and am looking forward to hearing about his experience here in Minnesota, and specifically as Korean American and on the White Earth Indian Reservation. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Berg.
Well, thank you, Tracy, for the introduction, and I'm really appreciative for the opportunity to present to the Cultural Thursdays at the Central Lakes College. So my title is From South Korea to the White Earth Nation, and I thought I would kind of begin by giving a little history of Korea, of course, my journey to Minnesota, and then now my journey to living on the White Earth Nation. So let's start with Korea here. I'm just kind of curious to know, and you can put this in the chat, if there's any people in the audience that are from Korea or perhaps have visited to Korea, or at least maybe has some intimate knowledge about Korea. And if there are none, that means that you may have to fact find me here on some of the dates here that I presented here. But really, I wanted to give you some context about Korea. Korea, you know, is a it is a really unique area in the world. It is very small. It's on a peninsula, and really the only way to get to Korea is by land, is through China. To the east is Japan. You've got China kind of on the north and the west side, and of course you've got you've got water that borders all around it. And so Korea was really a bunch of different dynasties that were consolidated into one dynasty, the Chosen dynasty. And that dynasty basically, I believe, ruled between 1300 AD to 1910. And what led to Korea being taken over or colonized by the Japanese was actually the Russian-Japan War. We've also got World War II and the Korean War. And I will go into those a little bit more into the next slide. Let's see here. So the Russian and Japan War, I've got two figures here. The one on the left is, of course, Theodore Roosevelt, and the person on the right is Tsar Nicholas II. And why I bring these two figures into the story is my wife loves Theodore Roosevelt. And the reason why she loves Theodore Roosevelt is because her family loves the national park system. And of course, he was very paramount in, ensuring that the United States had an ability to preserve its, its natural beauty. But one thing that a lot of people don't know is that Japan and Russia entered into a war. There basically was some disputed lands on the eastern front of Russia, bordering, of course, China, Japan. And that war between Japan and Russia was very devastating to Russia as well as to Japan. At that time, too, this was prior to World War I. And what was interesting was Russia was by far the superior country, and they actually had their military devastated. Theodore Roosevelt came in, brokered a peace agreement between the Japanese and the Russians. He actually got a Nobel Peace Prize for that. I believe the first US president to get a Nobel Peace Prize for creating peace. But one of that sense of peace was basically a prelude to where we are today in Korea. In that context was that in creating a peace between Russia and Japan, the United States would in essence turn a blind eye for Japan to take over Korea. And so after the accord was signed between Russia and Japan, the Japanese invaded the Korean Peninsula. You have then World War II, where you have the Russians and in the United States, as well as Germany, Britain, and France all engaged into a war. After the war, basically, you had an agreement in which Japan would leave Korea, and of course, Japan was a major player in the war too. But as a result, that when Japan left Korea, you had the Soviet Union kind of as a protector of the northern side of Korea, and you had the United States as a protector of the south of Korea. And so you have what led to two different, in essence, ideologies. And because of those ideologies, plus you had a desire for the Korean Peninsula to be unified, both Koreas wanted that. And so with the help of the Soviets in 1950, the North Korean army invaded South Korea. As a result of that, you had the United Nations sending troops into Korea, and there was a tit for tat. Basically, Douglas MacArthur invaded Incheon, pushed the North Korean military all the way up to the north, and of course he surged into China, which then prompted China to enter into the war, and that led to a protracted stalemate at the 38th parallel. The impact of the Korean War, of course, is known as the Forgotten War because it really only lasted 3 years, or 4 years. People remember a lot, of course, the Vietnam War that lasted several years, I think a decade and a half or two. The impact of the Korean War was devastating. 3 to 5 million people killed, 40,000 US soldiers. The Korean Peninsula is still divided today. There's about 15 to 20,000 US troops still stationed in Korea. The 38th parallel is, of course, one of the most militarized zones in the world. Princess Diane, of course, made the 38th parallel well known to the world because I guess if you want to consider one positive about the demilitarized zone is that because it's seated with probably the most landmines of any other place in the world, it's become a natural habitat for very endangered species and other animals and flowers. But having said that, the population was devastated. It is a very patriarchal family, and so you had a lot of orphans. Obviously, as a result of the war, it's a very homogeneous nation, and so you had a lot of babies too that may have been born from white soldiers or from African American soldiers, and they were shunned. The Korean population didn't have an ability to take care of the people. In the 80s, there was a military dictatorship, which obviously didn't help the situation. And so really, the country struggled. And so I luckily was adopted from those struggles. I was adopted into the United States. And before I jump into coming to America and everything else, I was just open up for any questions on Korea itself. Well, if there's no questions here, I will kind of talk a little bit about comparisons on Korean Minnesota. And I thought this would be kind of fun because a lot of people really don't know about Korea itself. And that is Korea and Minnesota. Here are some general statistics here. And I really wanted to share this to you when it comes to the demographics here. When you combine North Korea, so the statistics that I'm providing to you are only South Korea. When you include North Korea, that's square miles of Minnesota is about the same as North and South Korea combined. And so think about North and South Korea having a population of 75 million people combined, all living in the state of Minnesota. Minnesota, we have plains and we've got forests. It's relatively flat. I will say not as flat as maybe Nebraska or Kansas, but it's a relatively flat state. Korea is very hilly and very mountainous. And so imagine you've got a very condensed amount of people living in very large cities. Of course, the largest being the Seoul and Incheon metro area, about 25 to 30 million people. And then you've got Minneapolis, St. Paul being 3 to 4 million people. So just imagine if you were down in the Twin Cities and the population was 10 times that population. Let me jump back here. Sorry about that. Okay, so another kind of fun fact about Korea and Minnesota is that Minnesota has one of the highest concentrations of Korean adoptees in the United States. There were approximately 15,000 Korean Americans or Korean adoptees brought over to Minnesota. And, that started in the 50s, obviously after the war, pretty much accelerated all the way up to about 1980. It has slowed down considerably. South Korea for a while had a kind of a policy where they wanted to really take care of their own. And as, of course, the country became more or had greater capacity, they could do that. And so the bulk of the Koreans that are here are first generation Koreans like myself that came probably between 1970 to 1980. And so here's some pictures of me. I think the top one is pretty much maybe very soon after I came over from Korea. And then of course, here is me, I want to say maybe 1 or 2 years with one of my favorite characters, Big Berg. So kind of experience growing up in an all-white environment. I grew up in the Twin Cities, and I'll be honest, it was fairly white. And I don't say that in a mean way, it's just how it is. And so, some of the things that I've experienced growing up as a kid, I've experienced assimilation versus cultural identity, stereotyping in mass media, and of course, our Minnesota Nights. The one thing that I will say when it comes to assimilation or cultural identity is that, we always talk about, assimilation, mixing, or being a mixing pot of society. I see many people, many different cultures struggle with that, but yet some assimilate and they have no problem. They want to shed that, identity. They want to change their last name. They want to be immersed in English. They don't want to talk, a foreign language at home, where you have those that want to preserve their cultural identity or even seek it out. I really think it's important for you to know what is your comfort level. The nice thing about being a Korean American in Minnesota, in that we have such a large Korean adoptee population, is we have a Korean adoptee culture in the state. Actually, there is a Korean Quarterly, which is a quarterly newsletter that is printed in Minnesota for Korean adoptees. We have vibrant cultural camps. The adoptions agency I came from, the Children's Home Society, because they did place a lot of Koreans with Minnesota families, has a great culture camps, culture day camps, cultural programs to go back to Korea. The Concordia Language School up in Bemidji has a Korean camp, for instance, and there's other nonprofit groups throughout the state that have Korean immersion programs, Korean drumming programs, etc. And so it's really nice if you want to learn, about your Korean heritage. You can attend these as kids, but yet through the different stages from college into adulthood. I want to say though that, growing up, my parents were very much wanting us to learn about our cultural identity. It helped for me, I think, that I had a sister that was also Korean. She's not my biological sister, but yet it was nice to grow up, having another Korean sibling. My parents too were very open about us being adopted, and so having said that, they brought us to Korean culture camps, exposed us to food and other things that really made it easy for me to understand my cultural heritage and identity. But yet growing up too in a white environment, I encountered stereotypes, and I experienced the mass media. And one of the things that profoundly affected me was when I was about, I'd say, early elementary kid. I was riding my bike, I remember, and I got approached by 2 African Americans, and they were probably, in their 1820s, and they tried to steal my bike, and as a result, they physically hurt me. And that was a time too when you were exposed to the Rodney King police brutality incident, but then as a result of that, the race riots in LA. And if you recall the race riots in LA, a lot of that was targeted towards Koreatown. And there is a history and it's a dark history between African Americans and Korean Americans. And, you know, as a young kid growing up, not knowing much about, you know, about race, to experience, you know, what you're seeing on TV about the race rise between the Koreans and the African Americans, and your own experience. Unfortunately, you know, and I'll be honest, it put me in a position where I just I began to have my own stereotypes and views of other African Americans, and you know, it's really taken me through college and in my adulthood to learn that that's, you know, just that one incident is not a reflection of all African Americans, and so two was the race rise. We also have Minnesota Nice, which I think is unfortunately a big problem. I remember in college, a lot of people would, as I would go out with my white friends, and they would say, "Oh gosh, I'm glad I'm not like this," and geez, Mitch, I'm glad you're like us. And I'm like, well, what do you mean like you? I'm not exactly like you. And so there's a lot of, I'd say, implicit bias as well as implicit racism that I've encountered in Minnesota. I recall a time too when I was driving my parents' car down in South Minneapolis with one of my best friends who was Southeast Asian as well. And my parents happened to have a Cadillac. And I was frustrated when I got home because I said, boy, a Minneapolis cop car was following me the entire time I was driving through South Minneapolis. And you know, my mom at the time said, "Oh, well, that's just, you know, they're just wondering why a young kid is driving a Cadillac." And I said, "Well, no, that's because of their racial profiling." And you know, my mom told me that story after she started working in New York City. She said that to a janitor friend of hers that was African American, and she said, "Well, I just think the cops are generally concerned." And he said, "No, they were racially profiling." So, you know, we unfortunately do still encounter stereotyping as well as this Minnesota Nice that, you know, as well as micro racism too, which is hopefully something that, you know, we can work towards and strive for. Any questions so far or comments? Well, so, you know, I have to say that, let's see here. So I'm Tracy, can you maybe here, let's see here, kind of respond to the chat or follow that here? Okay.
I can read the question for you if you'd like.
Thank you.
So Suzanne Nelson asked, Dr. Berg, my Korean adopted adult son is still experiencing similar feelings about Blacks right now. It's a difficult time for him with everything going on in the world. And Corinne is asking, did you experience racism in your adopted family as well?
Well, let me ask Susan, you know, if kind of maybe what is she, kind of what are some of the feelings that he's experiencing that might help better with the context, or this was more of just a comment rather than a question?
Maybe it was just a comment, but feel free to
expound on that. Sure. You know, it's a struggle. I mean, I'll be very blunt. It took me many years to kind of get over that, you know, and it's one where, of course, it impacted you so personally. And then, of course, you know, with mass media and the stereotypes, it just kind of, you know, compounded everything. I just, you know, now that I work on and I know I'm sidetracking here, but I work now on the White Earth Indian Nation, and you know, I see a lot of stereotypes, you know, that say, well, you know, Indians are this or Indians are that, and really, having grown up in the Twin Cities, you know, I said, no, it's not an Indian thing; it's a poverty thing. And so, you know, I think one of the things that might help your current adult son is to just be, you know, really open to learning. Why is this? You know, and for me, it was, why is there that that kind of that rooted, you know, I don't want to say hatred, but the rooted anger towards African Americans and current adoptees, you know, kind of try and unwind that down and to try and explore it more. Um, you know, I'd also say that, um, you know, if Susan, we have any other thoughts on that, and I can kind of explain more as we go through the conversation. You know, Corinne asked, did you experience racism in your adopted family as well? You know, I don't really think I did. You know, growing up, you know, I don't think that, you know, my parents necessarily did either. But that doesn't mean that, you know, I knew that and I just didn't recognize it, or vice versa with my parents, that they didn't recognize it either. Uh, Racism, you know, has so many shades, as I'm finding out, you know, be from explicit racism to just simply say, well, and I'll tell you right now, and this is down the slide I was going to talk about. I was a city administrator in a city in western Wisconsin, and I was with my mayor and um, my engineer, and we were on a project, and one resident came up and he said, well, what ethnicity are you? And I said, well, I'm Korean. And he said, oh, I killed people like you. And then he left. You know, and I clearly remember that because the engineer that was with me was, he was actually from the Vietnam era. He served in the Vietnam War. He just said, Mitch, this isn't reflective of anything that, you know, we've ever would think. And I just said, yeah, I know that, you know. But that was a learning moment too, that I'll explain how I turned that into a learning moment. But so Audrey, you had the question that you identified that poverty is why racism. How do you explain those colors that are not in poverty still experiencing racism? That I'm not sure exactly what the question is. You know, I would say that if I'm trying to understand it here, you know, I think what I'm trying to say is that, you know, yes, there is racism, but I think people get things mixed up, you know, because what I've seen up here is that, you know, it wouldn't be a situation, it's not just Indians that are behaving like this. It is because of, you know, and I look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have to satisfy your basic needs first, of you know, food, shelter, you know, and healthcare. And then only once you can establish that, then you can move up that pyramid. And so when I say that, you know, why are people behaving like is because they're still at the lowest level of that triangle and they're not able to move themselves up. So for someone that's lived up here as a white person looking at the Native Americans, they say, oh, you know, for instance, Native Americans don't do X or don't do Y. Well, it's not because, again, they're Native Americans. It's, to me, it's because they're at that lowest step of the Maslow hierarchy of needs. And if anybody were in that same position, be it white or black, they would be doing the same thing or behaving in that same fashion. Does that help to explain both questions? I think there's two more questions. Tracy, can you ask that, or can you ask those?
There's a question not specifically related to, well, actually, maybe I'll take Mike's question first. It says, Dr. Berg, based on your doctoral dissertation research, what plays the greatest role in developing trust and cooperation between tribal organization and non-tribal organization?
I think it's about creating relationships. You know, different cultures. It was just really interesting, you know, to look at cultures around the world. And I think, you know, really what it boils down to is, you know, cultivating a relationship. The white culture is very transactional, right? You know, I want this, you give me that. With the Native communities, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel it's more about relationships. And so, you know, once you build a strong relationship, you can create that trust. And that trust can then can lead to those, you know, being able to move forward rather than just saying, hey, you know, I have cash, you give me this. Does that kind of help answer your question, Mike?
And then there was another question. What is your favorite Korean restaurant in Minneapolis? And what is a good dish to start with if you've never had Korean food before?
So there are so many restaurants now in the Twin Cities that are Korean restaurants. And I love the fact that, you know, as America becomes more colorful with our cultures, we're seeing much more ethnic restaurants. And obviously there's been just a craze. I think I had heard that wasabi now is like the #1 ethnic food to incorporate into any dish. And so you're seeing mainstream dishes have wasabi, for instance, or kimchi. You know, that's another popular dish. And so what I would say, if you want to try Korean and you're a good Minnesotan that has a Minnesota palate, I say bulgogi is a great start, because bulgogi is thinly sliced flank steak, and it's marinated in soy sauce, garlic, brown sugar, a little bit of sesame seeds, and some oil, and you barbecue it. And I'll be honest, I could go to a Korean buffet and eat bulgogi until I'm pretty stuffed. So with that, these are real good questions. And so keep them coming here, because you certainly are giving me a challenge here. But I want to know, you know, and this is something that, you know, and I don't know, you know, as a person of color, you're very much attuned to this. And so I would like to know if you are a person that, well, regardless if you're white or Asian or African American or Indian or Hispanic, or I'm just kind of curious, when was the last time someone was racist to you? And, you know, because I will tell very honestly, that was 2 months for me, downtown Fargo. I was walking down the streets and someone said, you know, oh, there you go, you're a chink. You know, and so there is one that says yesterday. You know, this is so for people to say, well, Minnesota or North Dakota, we're not racist, it's there. It's either, again, implicit or explicit or implicit. And I always say that, words do matter. And so when someone calls you a chink, or someone calls you a nigger, or someone calls you a gay, or some other type of word in a derogatory or demeaning way, it really basically is purposeful. So when I think of when Trump says the word China virus, he's trying to shift the blame, onto another culture. But yet he's trying to dehumanize a whole culture. And when you start to dehumanize cultures like Hitler had done to the Jews, you begin to, the dominant culture, the culture that you're trying to, project as something where, then you'd subhumanize a group. So with that, there's a couple other questions in the chat. Tracy, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So Jake says, to answer Mike's question, I think what plays the biggest role in developing trust and cooperation is approaching tribal governments before taking any action, make them aware of issues, projects, etc., that are coming up, and become a partner and involve them in the process. It will alleviate a lot of issues down the road.
I agree. Yeah, and let me jump here right away. I definitely agree, because there's one thing that people just assume, and that is that all tribal nations are the same or very similar, and each one is different. Each one has its own different history. And so, learning and understanding about their history before you approach them is very important. The other thing I would also add, and thank you, Jake, is that, and I am often guilty of this as well, I just assume I know what's best, and so I'll come into a conversation and say, we need to do this, or we need to do that. And oftentimes it's just best to, not say anything and say, what do you need? And to listen to what the tribe wants. And then, go from that, organically work towards reaching common ground. So I think that's good. Tracy, what was the other one?
And there's another question from Mike saying, if you have any, or asking if you have any suggestions that an organization can do to help address implicit bias.
Okay, so this is a real good question here. I've been doing a lot of research around this. The University of Minnesota Extension Office has has kind of a community leadership and vitality program. They've been really looking into ways to help communities, address systemic racism, address these implicit biases. One example that I've heard is that, and I could, and you can do this within an organization, is to do a book club. Take a book, it would be the book White Fragility, and then you can have a discussion with the members in the book clubs to talk about that. The League of Minnesota Cities, for instance, they've started to do some implicit bias training. You can bring in the IDI which is a cultural kind of an inventory, self-inventory quiz that you can have your employees take. And then, you can bring in somebody that can help them identify, okay, how do we move our community forward or our staff forward? There's another group that I'll have to think of the name, but it's through the League of Minnesota Cities, and they look at, are there systemic things within your own institutions that are preventing you from, addressing equity. For instance, are there hiring HR policies that are preventing you from hiring people of color? Are there ordinances that are on your books that make it more biased that or prevent you from doing things, or not prevent you from doing things, but prevent other cultures from being accepted into the mainstream cultures. So there's a lot of things. I can send Tracy some links too, and you can pass that out, or you can certainly reach out to me. So.
Or we could do that on the YouTube video. When we place this recording, we could put those links underneath. That's great.
Perfect. Any other questions that popped up?
So yes, how many times have you visited Korea, or how many times have you visited Korea after your adoption?
I've only visited once, and I will say, one of the things I jokingly tell my parents is that, why couldn't you have adopted me from, say, a Caribbean island, something that would maybe want me to go back there more often, or at least why couldn't I have been born in Las Vegas, where the flights are a little cheaper? It costs about $2,000 to fly over to Korea, so it's one of those things where you definitely have to plan for it. But when I went 20 years ago, and it was just a remarkable visit because I went with other Koreans. The Korean government had invited us all as Korean adoptees. And so we went as a group, about 40 to 80 Koreans from Europe, Asia, South, or from Australia and from South America. And it was just wonderful to interact with so many different other Koreans from around the world.
So I don't see any other questions at this time. We might have to come back to Audrey's question because I think it's a profound one. But I don't know if you have other information you'd like to share first.
Well, yeah, so I just wanted to say that, I experienced racism, explicitly and implicitly, but I also, saw that. So, and so how do you deal with injustice? I think you get involved. And so, when I went downtown Duluth and I got called racist names, I went to the mayor's office and I said, what the hell is going on here? I'm coming downtown, I'm being called racist names. Is this something that you want, to be known for as a community that is perceived to be racist and unwelcoming to people of color? And, when you pose these difficult questions, it makes people uncomfortable. But for that, I got appointed onto the Duluth Human Rights Commission. And so I began to work with entities, and I began to learn that there is a deep-seated racism in Duluth. I had encountered people that would specifically tell me, I'm not going to rent a housing unit to a Native American. And I think it goes again to that, well, is it because they're Native American, or is it because of, perhaps that they're in a poverty situation, because those exhibited behaviors that the Native Americans are doing that prompts you not to want to rent to them isn't indicative in my mind to that of a Native American. It's just someone who has lived in poverty. So again, that would be the same, be it if they're from the dominant culture or from Hispanic or from a different other culture. The one thing that I wanted to share too, and this is kind of fun, is so I decided to also become a city administrator, and that's my way too to give back to the community. And I really feel passionate about being a city administrator because I can also look and address equity in issues of diverse, and to bring diversity and inclusion into a community. And so I went up to the White Earth Nation to serve in the city of Mahnomen. And then I came back, got my doctorate, worked on my dissertation for travel, city, county relationships, exploring that, and then came back up to Mahnomen. But I've learned a lot about indigenous culture. This is a medicine wheel. It highlights the 4 different directions, and this is very much ingrained too in the Anishinaabe culture. And I was explaining to our secretary treasurer that, the Korean, values are very much similar. And so if you look at the Korean flag, for instance, you see those 4 directions. You also see the yin and the yang, the balance. So where you see in the medicine circle, you see a circle. When you look at the 4 symbols that represent, earth, wind, fire, water in the Korean flag, you see that you see that as part of the indigenous culture. And what I really find fascinating about this is these are 2 different cultures, that were established millennial, apart from each other, and they come with the same and somewhat similar values. And so to me, that just reflects that, although we're different cultures, we share very common threads. And so with that, a little bit about the White Earth Nation. So there's 11 tribal nations in Minnesota, 7 Ojibwe, 4 Dakota. The Ojibwe, they're also known as the Anishinaabe. In the English, call them Chippewa. Dakota, that is a word too. And Dakota, there's another name, Sioux. And that is an American name, or an English name. So the White Earth Nation, though, or the White Earth Band, is the largest of the tribal nations, with about 18,500 band members. And approximately, I'd say 6,000 to 8,000 band members live within the White Earth Indian Reservation. And then Mahnomen County and the city of Mahnomen reside entirely within the reservation boundaries, which is very unique. There's one other county in Wisconsin, for instance, that is entirely within the boundary, or it's counter to the boundary of their reservation, the Mahnomen Band. But there's very few counties and very few cities that are wholly within a Indian reservation. So what does the city administrator do? City administrators, what I say, a city administrator, this is the best job if you have ADHD, because I bounce around doing so many different things. I will say that the city administrator, though, basically does the day-to-day operations of the city. And so, for me, what does it mean to be a city administrator as a person of color? Well, again, I go back to the example where the resident said, "What ethnicity are you?" And I said, "I'm Korean." And he said, "Oh, I kill people like you." When I came up to Mahnomen, our local paper asked me, if I was foreign. And from that experience in Western Wisconsin, I learned to say, well, exactly what difference does me being from another country bear with me being effective city administrator? And it caught them off guard, and so if they say, well, nothing, then I say, well, then it's really none of your business. But I think, being a city administrator, you can really champion equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'll give you a couple of examples. COVID really, to me, highlighted the challenge of being a city administrator in a community that, has a lot of social and economical differences. And so some of the things that I did even before the governor did this was we said, we're not going to turn off anybody's water if they're late. Not only did we decide not to turn people's water off, but if they were late, we weren't going to charge anything. We usually charge a late penalty. And because we acknowledge that, you know, we don't want to get people so behind so that when it does come to, you know, the pandemic being over, that these people are just so, you know, dug themselves into such a hole that they can't get themselves out of. You know, we did other things with our employees. We have a number of part-time employees that we said we're going to allow up to, I believe, 2 weeks of paid vacation. You know, if you test positive because of COVID, or if you have a relative that stayed with you, or significant other, a immediate member of your family, you know, and we didn't offer any type of paid leave prior to that. And so, you know, for me, it's about, you know, leveling that playing field so that our residents and our own staff can, you know, at least be comfortable if something happens to them, that they're able to have some sort of a, you know, a cushion that they can't fall so behind. Is there any other questions, Tracy?
There's the start of one from,
Okay.
but I'm not it, but it didn't finish. But I know that the question about poverty and how that's related to racism, I don't know that that was fully addressed. That how do you explain how those of color not in poverty still experience racism? But that, like you said, could be due to mass media or what we're taught about, you know, status of, I shouldn't say status, but how we view or how we treat others, you know, from our surroundings. But I'm not sure that we were able to address her question before she had to leave.
Yeah,
It's a difficult one.
it is. You know, and I look to, obviously, when the Europeans came over, you know, there was you know, bias and racism if you were Irish, or if you were Italian, or if you were Protestant, or you were Christian. You know, I think that racism in itself is just a guise to, you know, put another class of people, you know, down, or in terms of put them subservient to another entity. And so, you know, again, you know, I look at, and so when you see people create I would say, a false narrative that, you know, oh, you know, Native Americans are this, I and stereotype it like that. You know, again, I would say, well, is it truly, you know, it's again, when I see poverty, you know, I see some of these same exhibited behaviors from a person in poverty, if they're white or African American or Asian. And so then I say, well, it's not really a race, you know, it's not racism to me. But, you know, it's hard for people to determine that because they only see that exhibited within the lens that they live in, you know, or see it by the media that they see it in. So that is a good question, though.
So we have just a couple of minutes here. I don't know if you want to do your takeaways at this time.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, you know, be you. Don't let others tell you who you ought to be. And, you know, it's, again, you know, even as an Asian American, you know, I don't at all equate myself to the same Asian ness of a Japanese American, or a Lebanese American, or an Australian American, or you know, a Russian, you know, or Baltic, or not Baltic, but Caspian Asian. And so, really, be you, don't let others tell you that, oh, you're just, Hispanic, or you're just, Native American. Be proud of who you are. Explore your own heritage, and don't be afraid to seek out the good and the bad. Be open-minded to learn these false logics, because I think I think this nation's getting more and more divided, where now we can only go to Fox News or Open Max or CNBC, or we look at news to help verify what we believe is to be the correct narrative, and I think that's bad. So I encourage people to read the other side, to get a better understanding. With that, then, to be global citizens, travel around, and just meet with other people, meet with other cultures, even if it's within your own state. Advocate for equity and inclusion. So for me, I got mad when I got called racist names in the city of Duluth. And so I got on the Human Rights Commission. You don't necessarily need to jump to that extreme. You can read a book about race and equity. You can have start a book club. You can, so you don't need to jump in right out, with both feet. You can just kind of do what you want to do to be comfortable. Do what's morally and ethically right. I think that can be difficult because, again, Adolf, when you look at Hitler's Germany, what was morally and ethically right was to exterminate the Jewish population. But don't let others coerce you into doing something that you just don't believe is the rightful and truthful thing. And then again, don't let race define who you are. I think that it's a very easy thing for people to get into this, this negative situation where, geez, I feel bad, or I should be feeling bad. Okay, if you're feeling bad about this because of what happened with George Floyd, or you're feeling bad about what happened, with police brutality, or with something else, do something to change that to something positive. And so with that, I really appreciate the time. Tracy, if there's any other questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them in the little time we have.
I don't see any, but if anyone has, hang on a second. Welcoming communities is a big movement these days. How Native Americans feel when others, white folks, lead these types of efforts, knowing that this land doesn't belong to them.
Oh, I can't say that as a non-Native American, but I can only tell you that it's not a good thing. I think when, and this is something as a city administrator that I strive for. And if you're in the business community, or if you're going into business, or you're going into government or nonprofit, you want to bring in as many diverse folks as you can to have a conversation. If you only have white folks leading the conversation, it's not, and I don't mean to diminish the white, but if you have a dominant culture, it's going to be perceived as, well, again, they're telling us how we ought to do things. It reminds me of these cities that say, well, we've got a problem, so let's create a Native American Day, or let's change the name from Christopher Columbus to Native Indigenous Day. And, they think, oh, that's going to solve the problems in our community. Well, it's not going to solve the problems in the community. You need to engage all of the members in the community. If it's a situation where Native Americans, if there's an issue with Native Americans, you got to include them. The Blandon Foundation told me that, Mitch, if you're going to have a conversation about race, it has to be at least 60% Native Americans versus it being 60% white, because that's just not going to lead to a good outcome.
Thank you so much. I think that tip about listening is so key, and not assuming that we know what's best in a situation where it affects many people, that we need to sit back and listen to everyone involved. So thank you again for speaking with us today, for your insight, as Mike says, very informative. I appreciate you sharing. And I think there are others as well. Let's see. History has played a big part in racism, especially with the Native American communities. I think you've made some progress here, and I commend you for your efforts. The Native voices need to be heard. Miigwech.
Miigwech, everyone.
And there are some thank yous coming in the chat, Mitch.
I should say, if people want to reach out to me, they sure can. My email is mberg10@hamlin.edu, and I could probably post that in the chat here. Or maybe here I can.
Thank you all for joining us today. You might just want to hang on if you want to get that. There's that email. If you have any additional questions for Dr. Berg, you can get that in the chat right now. He's just posted that for you. We definitely have work to do, and I appreciate all of you coming in to learn how you can help your own communities and ourselves on undoing some of the implicit biases that we have. So on that note, take care, and thank you again, Dr. Berg.
Thank you.